Okay, thank you everybody for coming. It's a great turnout. I'm not surprised. This is a very exciting evening for us to kick off this process. I want to start by introducing myself. My name is Gary Klieman. I am the chair of the newly formed Nuclear Metals Inc. Starmet Reuse Committee. I'm going to be hearing a lot of jargons, a lot of terms, a lot of committee names, but this is a new committee that's been formed by the Select Board to consider this site. And I want to share with you, first of all, how excited many of us are. Town residents serving on both the NMI Reuse Committee as well as the 2229 Main Street Committee, working on behalf of the Select Board, a lot of Select Board members I see around here tonight, but also the rest of you, the town of Concord, because this is a truly unique and special opportunity to reuse and redevelop several areas of the Starmet parcel, between 20 and 30 acres, of which is mostly unimpacted, wooded land for whatever benefit the town would like. That doesn't come around that often. The cleanup of those specifically affected areas on the parcel is also unprecedented for any kind of soil-impacted Superfund site like this. And I say it's unprecedented because we're spending nearly $250 million that will have been spent on multiple scientifically driven, town-overseen efforts to bring this site up to the most stringent cleanup standard so that it can be safely used for just about any purpose. So that's why we're excited. And I hope you'll share that excitement and enthusiasm with me, but I also want to acknowledge that in our initial outreach with other town committees, some boards, and stakeholder groups, we have heard some concerns from some people about some of the potential uses we've discussed at this site, given its status as a Superfund site. So I want to just give you 4 points in the hopes that we can have a productive discussion tonight, the objective of this meeting, about some potential uses while still being cognizant of safety issues and concerns that many people have, or some people have. The first point that I would make is that this site will not be used for any purpose until the site is cleaned up to a residential standard, as I mentioned, the highest, most stringent standard for cleanups under these conditions, as verified by the US Environmental Protection Agency and their consultants, probably another 5 to 7 years away, so it's still a ways off. We have to go through this cleanup process. Another $125 million worth of cleanup. That's over and above the $100 million that has already been spent cleaning up this site, removing some contaminated soil, removing contaminated buildings. Another $125 million is going into this. Well, the second point, we are incredibly lucky in this town to have a lot of smart people living here and dedicated people, including a dedicated set of stakeholders, including the citizen group crew, Citizens Research Environmental Watch, maybe some of you are here tonight, members of our 2229 Main Street Committee that I already mentioned, who have been carefully monitoring this cleanup for more than a decade to ensure that it's done right and that it's done with proper diligence. Point 3, how many fingers am I holding up? Third point, Superfund program is set up to work out legal arrangements that protect the town from any future liability around any potential residual contamination that could remain, in this case, deep underground, where it's protected from harming surface after the cleanup is complete. And finally, if the town is not comfortable with any of the uses that we come up with, we're not committed to doing anything that we discuss tonight. There will be plenty of time to talk after the cleanup is complete about what we actually want to do with this site. But if we want to have any input at all in the final site remediation, this last phase of the cleanup, we have to identify some potential uses that we think are likely to be the uses we would like to see there so that we can inform how the site is to be restored for future use. That's the real objective tonight, is to identify some potential uses, not confirmed uses, not definite uses, potential uses, so that the cleanup can continue, which is really important. It's still going to take a while, still going to be a massive investment of science, resources, et cetera, but at the end of it, we will have a clean site with a tremendous potential for the town. So I'm excited about this. I look forward to working with you. I want to now introduce some folks from US EPA that are here tonight. Sarah and Chris is going to speak next. After that, we're going to hear from SKIA, which is a consulting firm working on behalf of US EPA. And Matt and Haley are going to come up and then explain the format of the workshop. But first, Chris, I'm going to pass it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Chris Smith. I am EPA's project manager for this site. It's really important to EPA that we are considering future reuse and redevelopment of all these Superfund sites throughout the whole process, and particularly important at the stage that this site is approaching now, which is the stage at which the remedy is designed and then implemented. So I really appreciate you all coming. We can't do that without the input from the community. So this is just a nice aerial view of the site. These black areas are the former footprints of where the buildings used to stand when they were still in operation. Have another figure here with some labels on it. So again, it's black area, former building footprint, and then parking area, some wooded areas. It's about a 46-acre parcel of land. There's a ponded area here called the Cooling Water Recharge Pond. Over here you see a sphagnum bog. That's just a wetland feature that the site has. And then here is what is referred to as the holding basin. So when the facility was in operation, they operated at a time where environmental laws were less stringent, so there's a lot of improper disposal. One of the main ways is they dumped some of their waste into this holding basin, which is essentially was a hole in the ground. That resulted in groundwater contamination, and there's also soil and sediment contamination across the site. So in 2001, after some of the contamination was discovered, it was listed on the National Priorities List, which is EPA's list of sites which become Superfund sites and then go through the whole Superfund process. So since then, EPA has been working with Mass DEP and the town of Concord, the community, particularly the 2229 Main Street Committee, to develop and oversee cleanup of the site in concert with some of the responsible parties who have financial liability for cleaning up the site. So some of that cleanup work has entailed removing radioactive waste from the buildings while they were still standing, demolishing the building themselves, shipping all that waste off site. Like Gary was saying, that's come at the cost of probably around $100 million. So a lot of work has gone into the site so far. And then additionally, we do a remedial investigation to determine where the contamination is in groundwater, in soil, in sediment. And what that led to is in 2015, EPA released the record of decision for the site. That's the document that guides what the cleanup for the site will be and how it will proceed. So at a very basic level, we could spend all night talking about that one document. It's technically complex. We really want to keep the focus tonight on redevelopment, so I'm just going to give a very brief summary. There's going to be soil excavation across the site, sediment excavation of this pond, something like 80,000 cubic yards of sediment and soil we expect to ship off-site for disposal in a hazardous waste landfill, a little bit of remediation and sediment removal in the sphagnum bog. Groundwater will be treated. There's multiple contaminants in groundwater that require treatment. And then this holding basin area where some of the high-level wastes are will be stabilized, so we'll inject stuff that will make sure that it's not mobile, and then it'll be capped and surrounded with what's called a containment wall to ensure that that waste remains in place and indefinitely. So that's sort of at a basic level what the remedy will entail. And what's also really important to note that Gary mentioned is that we're pursuing a really aggressive cleanup plan for this site, which will enable future uses of the property to include residential use, which has the strictest requirements for the levels that everything has to be cleaned up to. So I think that's great because, in some cases you might end up with a property that's only suitable for future industrial use or commercial use. In this case, you really don't have those limitations. It could be residential area, soccer field, that sort of thing. So keep that in mind as we're going through this presentation tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Matt from SKIO. He has a presentation to follow this that really gets more into looking at this property and the ways that it can be reused effectively and can solicit your input. Before he comes up here, if there's any questions for me, I'm happy to take them now. Otherwise, we can do them at the end as well. Go ahead. To be determined, I believe still, but probably. Oh yeah, sure. She asked where the disposal site is for the sediment and soil that'll go off-site. I believe it's somewhere in Indiana. There's a limited number of sites that are capable of taking hazardous waste like this and storing it safely. So, yep. Yes.
5 years ago, there was a dioxide plume running underneath Main Street towards the Acton water wells. What's the status of capturing poisonous water and treating it?
Sure. So, as part of that 2015 record of decision, EPA accelerated that portion of the remedy through a removal action. So the Aspet River is over here to the north of the property, and then further north than that, north to the northwest is Acton's Wellfield. And you're right that they discovered that there was 1,4-dioxane, one of the contaminants in groundwater was moving towards the town of Acton's Wellfield. So across the river, there is now a pump and treat system operating. A well cuts off that plume of 1,4-dioxane and treats the 1,4-dioxane to very low levels where it's then safe for discharge. So it's effectively containing the plume of that contaminant and preventing any more of that 1,4-dioxane from reaching the town of Acton's wells. Yes?
Where does it go? How do they get rid of it?
The water?
The dioxide?
So the question was, what happens to the 1,4-dioxane? So the treatment system actually destroys the chemical. That's the process, and then that treated water, which has now met all the treatment standards, is discharged into the river. Yep. And then one other thing I wanted to note, the 2015 document that guides what the cleanup will be, it then needs a legal agreement for how EPA will oversee the parties that are implementing the remedy. We need to know what the process will be for them designing and then implementing the remedy to clean up the site. So what that takes the form of is a consent decree, which actually it's a great time to have this meeting because the consent decree, which we've been working on for several years, was just finally approved by the Department of Justice. It's now available online for review by whoever wants to look at it. It starts a 30-day public comment period, which actually just started today. So really, we couldn't have had better timing for this meeting. Again, that just generally describes what the cleanup will be and EPA's, the communities, the state's role in overseeing the cleanup. As EPA, we can't really get into the specifics of it while the comment period is ongoing, but we certainly will be having discussions after the comment period ends, and we respond to those comments with any interested community members, including the 2229 Main Street Committee, about what the cleanup will entail, what that document says. So, a couple more.
Yeah, we have time for one more question, and then we can take some more at the end.
I think you were in the back. You're up first.
During the next cleanup process, is there any health risks for the residents around the area?
So to ensure that there isn't, there will be. The question was, is there any health risks to the residents around the area while the cleanup is ongoing? And the one health risk that we would want to make sure doesn't become a problem is any airborne contamination that would occur because we're removing all these soils and sediments. And we will take many precautions to ensure that does not happen, including air monitoring, and during the remediation of some of this area in the past, like the building demolition, there was never any concerns that were serious with the surrounding community being exposed to any contamination from the site. So we don't believe that will be an issue during the next phase of the cleanup.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt for a minute. Okay. On paragraph number 4 on your news release, quote, Textron and Whitaker will perform the cleanup at the site. That seems to me you're letting the fox into the henhouse.
So the question was about allowing Textron and Whitaker to oversee or perform the cleanup. So the way it works is they are the parties some of the parties responsible for the contamination on the site, they are responsible for performing the cleanup. They hire their own consultants to oversee and perform the cleanup, but EPA has oversight of them. So we have oversight. We hire our own consultants to constantly review what they're doing. They're not doing anything without EPA approval. So we have the ultimate authority, the ultimate oversight. They are just responsible for hiring the consultants that will make it happen. That's how that process works. I'm going to turn it over to Matt in the interest of time, but I can answer any questions later as well.
Pam, it looked like you wanted to say something. I don't want to cut you off. Hi, my name is Matt Roby. I work for a consulting company called Skio. As Gary said at the outset, we've been working with EPA, with the EPA New England office in Boston. We work as part of a program at EPA nationwide called the Superfund Redevelopment Initiative. And we work with communities like yourselves and project teams like EPA and the steering committee and the reuse committee that the town of Concord has formed. This is what we do for a living. And since February of 2019, we've been working with town staff and EPA to figure out a process that would optimize the community of Concord and surrounding towns, providing input into the future land use of the Nuclear Metals Inc. 22229 Main Street site. And this is a brief schedule of the activities that have happened in that time. I'm going to walk through an analysis that we started over the winter and we vetted with the town's reuse committee that looks at where are the developable areas at this site and how big are they and what might that mean for the cleanup down the road and what might that mean for future uses. So we'll get into that. After doing that, the town formed the reuse committee. We held a couple of meetings. The town's been doing outreach, as Gary said, since late summer to share ideas and generate preliminary ideas about the types of goals and principles that might make sense for this site. And now here we are at this workshop gathering broad-based community input that will go into a report that Skio will put together and will help to sort of guide the town, how the town moves forward with planning and the ultimate disposition and reuse of the property. And also the outcomes of this can help to guide some of the cleanup work. So we'll go into this in a little bit more detail. As many of you may know, the site is located in the southwest corner of the town of Concord, near the line with Maynard and Sudbury on Main Street. It's about 25 miles from Boston, 10 miles from 95, and a couple miles from Route 2. Its location in this part of the town makes it both an important regional opportunity because it's so close to the bordering towns and on an important transportation corridor. Just to sort of put some pictures to the maps that Chris was showing, and some of you may have seen these before, currently the site is accessible from one access road, The site is accessible from one access road off of Main Street. The concrete slabs that Chris showed as the dark areas on the map are here on the top. And those are sort of the former facility areas. And then there are surrounding areas that were the cooling water recharge pond, which is a very deep pit full of water, large feature, the holding basin, which Chris mentioned, and the sphagnum bog. Chris talked about the cleanup plan, a $125 million cleanup plan, which was funded and finalized in the agreement that was signed last week. This map shows how some of that work will be performed. A lot of that work involves excavating the contaminated soils to make the property safe for future uses. And ultimately, the site soils will be cleaned up, slabs will be demolished, and some materials will be consolidated in the holding basin area. That area will be capped off and will have some limitations on what can happen on top of it in the future, but the remaining parts of the site will have few restrictions. In order to better understand how the rest of the site what types of uses might make sense for the rest of the site, the analysis we did looked at the natural features and the grades, and so these maps show the contours, which is how steep it is, where are the flat areas, where are the steep areas, where are the water features. There's stormwater ponds, there's the sphagnum bog, where does the drainage go? And in putting these two pieces together, sort of the access, how do you get to the areas? What are the grades and wetland and water features like? And then how does the cleanup plan affect the site? We developed this map, which we call the reuse zones map, and it essentially says, here are the developable areas. So if you look at the yellow areas, you'll see zones A, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are the areas that are identified basically as potential development zones at the site. And they make up about 20 acres, as much as 23, as little as 16 or 17. And then another 25 plus acres of land that would essentially be open space. The three different zones provide a little bit more detail. So A are the development zones. B is the capped area where contaminated soils will be treated and then placed under a cap for long term. And zone C is the wetland and other open space areas. And then D is the cooling water recharge pond, which, unlike the wetland, is an area that most likely would serve as stormwater management for areas that might be paved or might be hard surfaces where water runs off after uses have been created. We come up with a map like this so that when we ask the community for input into what should happen in the future, we have a realistic idea of how much land there is, what the development footprint might look like, and then we can get more realistic ideas to frame recommendations. So just to kind of recap, this site offers 16 to 23 acres of developable land, and the future uses for those areas could be residential, housing, they could be commercial, they could be light industrial, and they could be combinations of uses or mixed uses. And then in addition to that, there's another 20 plus acres of land that could be for access and trails, that could be for stormwater management, and for passive recreational use. Beyond the physical issues with the reuse of the property, one of the other considerations for this particular property is its ownership status. It is tax delinquent property. The amount of money that has been spent to date on cleanup and work to understand the status of the property has resulted in a lot of liens being placed on the properties. So in order for any developer or future owner to do anything with this property, a lot of those back taxes, those unpaid taxes, and those outstanding liens need to be settled. In cases like this, with properties like this that have essentially been abandoned, there's a role for the town and the municipal government in helping clearing the way for that property to be sold, put back on the tax rolls, or put back into use by the communities. And so at this particular site, one of the other options here is that the town has a clear path to future ownership of the site property that could come with certain liability protections. Oftentimes, if people are thinking about purchasing a Superfund site or a former Superfund site, they're concerned about are they going to take on liability. There are ways that municipalities can gain protections as a future owner when they acquire property that they get because it's abandoned. So tonight, how can tonight's input be used? There are a variety of different ways that the input we get tonight will be helpful. One, the town of Concord's own local land use processes. Other regional economic development planning might be local land use plans that would benefit from this input. For the perspective of actually the development opportunities and the needs of the community, we're hoping to come out of this with some idea of scenarios or combinations of uses that might help to actually inform a future development plan. Ideas of how the site could better connect the communities that it's close to. And then in terms of the site and the site team and EPA and the folks who will actually be designing and implementing the cleanup plan, some of the information that you share with us tonight can help them create the plans that they need for accessing the site, recreating the grades after the cleanup is done so that it optimizes the community's vision for the site. So there are a lot of ways that the input you all provide can help us. I think we have time for a few questions before we go into discussion, we can take those now.
In terms of the holding pond that you had at the beginning, I understand it's going to be capped off. Is it going to be empty? Is it dug down and then you're going to fill it with something? Because currently it's just a hole. It does not have a bladder. So I'm saying you just cap it.
My understanding is that it is going to be much deeper, and the material is going to be encased somehow, and then it will be capped level at the top, so it won't look like a hole anymore.
I'm more concerned with what's on the bottom and that leaching out.
I think that's a good question for EPA.
That seems to be what the plume and everything else was.
Right. So as it stands now, there's a temporary cover on the basin to prevent the infiltration of more water that would spread the plume. But as part of the remedy, there's going to be an injection of a material that essentially, it's mostly depleted uranium is the contaminant that is of concern in that holding basin. There's going to be an injection of a material that actually solidifies and prevents that media from leaching out. Also, the bedrock on the bottom of that basin will be filled in with like grout to prevent further contamination that way. There will be a containment wall around the perimeter of what's left there. The reality of how much waste is in there and it wasn't feasible and how deep it is, it wasn't feasible to excavate and ship that all off-site. So that's why in the remedy it was selected as treatment in place, but there's going to be a lot of testing, years of study on how to make sure that is done effectively, and then impermeable cap at grade on the surface.
How deep was it?
I want to say in the neighborhood of 80 feet. That could be wrong. So, yeah.
Ma'am at the back.
Can you speak to why licenses now and development, and what was the hurdle that was passed that made this, and was that hurdle achieved in the last 3 years, by which Concord is now ready to host an event like this and say this is ready?
Yeah, I will. The question was, what is it that makes now the right time for a meeting like this? And what happened in terms of EPA's process that makes this a good time?
So part of it, that 2015 record of decision I referenced, that was finally put into place. So we know what the cleanup of the site will look like. And then we started working on that consent decree I was talking about, which will govern, sort of the legal end of how it all proceeds. So it's just, now that we have that in place, this is the time where we want to start thinking about what the potential reuse of the property would be, because like Matt was saying, there's some potential to make the remedial design, the remedial action that will occur there, to assist the community in what they see as the future use. So that's why we've proceeded down this path now. And EPA has an initiative across all our sites to really focus on redevelopment through the help of SKIO, the company that Matt works for, which helps us look at these properties and work with the community.
But have the criteria in any way been lessened or minimized in the past 3 years?
The question was, have the criteria been lessened or minimized at all in the last 3 years? And the answer is no. It's just that this is the right time for us to start looking at it. It has nothing to do with lessening any of their criteria. Yep.
Yeah, that question was sort of in 2 parts. One was what makes this a good time to have this meeting, and that's partly a question for EPA, but seems like it's also partly for the town.
So you may have heard that the consent decree was signed and is now under being commented on. Once the consent decree is signed and the funding is in place for this, they're going to do a period of remedial design that's going to take about 18 months. And in 18 months, they're going to come up with the plans for how they're going to do the excavation, moving stuff around, where they're going to put their trucks, where they're going to put their pave the areas to get in for their machinery, and how they're going to leave the site when they're done. So if we don't say something about how they leave the site, we're going to get a big field. But the options at this site, A2, for instance, on this map is a hillside that might actually provide great fill to fill in above the material that they remove, above the cap that they put in the holding basin, and to replace some of the soils that they remove where the foundations of the buildings are going to be removed. They're going to have electrical access for their work. We have a power line that goes up to a substation on Forest Ridge Road. We have solar panels across the street. If we want to put in a battery facility at this site in the future, we might want to be sure that that's where their access to the power lines are when they do their cleanup. We might want to see different uses for the cooling pond, whether it gets restored as just a drainage pond with a bunch of rocks in it, or whether it actually gets restored with native plants and a nice rainwater garden. If we want trails put in, we'll have decisions to make about that. There's an old retaining wall that's gravel that's falling apart on the site that provides access to an area. Given the choice, they will not restore that. They'll just knock it down. And so we need to have a decision, basically, if we want it to be restored so that there is driving access to some parts of this site, then we want to say that. So having an idea of what we can do with this site right now can make a big difference. It doesn't commit us to using it that way, but it means that they're more likely, if we say we want to park our dump trucks on top of the old holding basin when we're done, then that means that cap is going to be hardy enough that we can drive dump trucks on it every day without it being damaged, and it will be compacted well and done well for that purpose. They're going to make the remedy fit what we are going to do with the site afterwards if we give them a clue that here we might want to put a building, here we might want to put a road, here we might want utility access, here's a space that we might want to have septic at some place, so we don't want to have some other kind of facility there. So that's why it's important now, because we have this 18-month window to actually make some comments before it's done and optimize this cleanup so that it's ready to go when we're done. So it's not about the standards changing, it's about this is when it's happening, let's take advantage.
And so you have, I think the other part to this is you'll have EPA and the team that is funded to do the cleanup work ready, and you have the town's reuse committee that's been working and ready to take the input that you provide and help integrate it into that process. So this is super exciting. Front row.
Is there any problem with barium pollution there? And also, how much is the financial contractor liens and tax liability that would have to be paid off? And who would end up eating that? The town? Or does that mean we have to sell it to developers for that cost?
There's 2 parts to your question. One was about barium, which I'm going to defer to EPA, but I'm going to answer the first one. There are millions, $2,500 million in liens and cleanup from the Department of Defense that are partially settled through the consent decree that went through. What? That were addressed. Yeah, they're addressed in the consent decree addresses a lot of them, but some of them need to be worked out, which doesn't mean that the town necessarily needs to eat them. But they're liens. There's a path where the town could acquire the property through tax foreclosure that would put the town in a good position. The cleanup is funded by by other parties, not by the town. So none of those. It's only tax liens are the only thing that I'm talking about here. Yep. Any more questions? Yes. One more. One more. It doesn't go into the Cranberry Lane development. It drains to a stormwater outfall to the street. The question was, where does the cooling water recharge pond drain to? It drains out towards Main Street. All right. So, yeah, Haley, can you come up and do our transition? So there's 4 groups.
Hi everyone, my name's Haley Gannon, I'm with SKIO. We're about to move into our next phase of this meeting. So we're gonna go into breakout sessions. There are 4 tables. There's one over there, one over here. We're gonna use this one at the front. And then if you go out that hall and hang a right, there's another room that's gonna have a 4th station. Each of them is gonna have a facilitator and a few co-facilitators. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna walk you through what all the materials are at the table, and then we're gonna get into some discussion about what reuses you might like to see on the site after we explain a little bit about the maps, a little bit about the handouts, and we're gonna all go through it together. So if you can try and, as evenly as you can, distribute yourselves among those 4 stations, that would be great. Thank you so much.
We won't ever allow excavation beneath that depth. So going down to that.
Okay, I'm going to start the recap here because it is 6:30. All right, so there are 4 groups. We're going to take a couple minutes each and just the facilitators are going to share what we talked about. Are you ready?
Hi, everybody. If I could just have everybody attention, we're just going to report out on Group 4, some of the great ideas that the group came up with on reuses for the nuclear metal site. Some of these are comments as well. So I'm going to run through some of the ideas that came out of our group. One of the subjects that was talked about, has the committee looked at a long-range plan? Is one of the questions that came up. West Concord, a comment was made, is underserved. Residents would like to see a conservation, recreational use, make a connection from the site to neighboring areas such as the Stop and Shop Center. And that particular commenter would like to see the majority of the site as recreational, natural, open space. An opportunity to do housing, mixed use with commercial is a priority on mixed income housing, mixed use in retail and retail housing is another idea that came up, is to have just a combined retail with housing. The idea of climate change was a big driver was mentioned a few times during this discussion. So one idea is just to plant a lot of trees on the site so we can replenish, clean the environment. Another idea is to make the site a regional transportation hub with charging stations for electric vehicles. Another interesting idea that came up was to create a bicycle velodrome, an indoor building with a track. Apparently there's none in this area, so. And also maximize the natural space by going vertical as much as possible rather than, sprawl. Going up and then digging underground to create garage space. And also to run buses and shuttles to the train stations and to various parts of town was another, and that goes back to the transportation hub idea. And someone made a comment that historically there'd been some opposition in the past to using the site for living or housing due to the concern about contamination. And another comment that was made related to that is people should think, as far as housing, would you want your family to live there, knowing its history? So that was another comment that claimed that. But the site will be clean to residential standards, so that concern still exists. Another comment was made to expand on the idea of a transportation hub, run advanced shuttles from the hub to parts of Concord and to the trains to Boston. Climate change will be a driver on how any reuse is planned. Again, going back to the idea of a transportation hub, cut down on the traffic. There was a discussion about whether cost, I can skip over that one. All right, I'm skipping over that one. A town should be open to the concept of co-housing, where you have communal spaces, like eating spaces, but people also have their own like private rooms and all that. So, and another commenter went back to anything that will take the cars off the road should be looked at. I'm just running, these are in no particular order because it was, kind of free thought going. Co-housing should be encouraged. A senior center would be fine. It would be a great site for a tech facility, a large tech company that could tap into the fiber optic network, and also you could use it as a co-working space. These would be sort of complementary ideas. And as far as things to combine, the main key ideas were a transportation hub. You could combine that with an energy or battery storage or electrical vehicle hub. There's recreation. Someone mentioned creating an artist space for artists, housing, cable tech innovator space, and indoor track. So these are some of the ideas, the sort of the main ideas. Yeah. Is that it? Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry.
So the one really cool new idea out of this that I heard was that the cable in town, the fiber optic that's spread out makes, if we were to have a fiber optic center where we actually moved our cable TV studios up to this site and then maybe had a lot of innovator space, new tech companies, new people that could work there, whether that's a rental space or just a subsidized space or something like that, but it's ideal to kind of to wrap these things together and think of them as maybe one part of whatever use we have at this site.
I'm going to go next. Okay. And I know that there are funds from Mass Development that could help with that. So for group number 2, some of the uses that we felt were missing, there's a question about, do we still need soccer fields, a school bus facility? There's still some grumbling about where we are located. A small number of affordable housing if there's transportation provided, plus regular housing. Single-family subsidized housing, smaller scale housing, possible another swimming pool, a public swimming pool to serve the people on the west side of Concord as part of an indoor recreation center. Consider a transportation hub or a facility that connects to desired locations in adjacent communities. We know that Maynard, Sudbury, and Acton are all building significantly sized affordable housing projects. Connecting to trails, perhaps a nature center, or at least a pavilion for bird watching and picnic tables. And the concept of a trail necklace was raised that I thought sounded really cool. The combination that we thought that the group talked about was a transit hub with parking for, and residential, small 1,500 square foot housing units, maybe for workforce housing, a Bradford Mill-like space, I think that goes to the worker space, supporting commercial uses such as a coffee shop, restaurant, and convenience store, trail access to Forest Ridge, connections to the bog, and a recreational use such as a field house.
I'm going to go fairly quick on my groups as well. A lot of similar themes. So there was some concern about traffic running around Main Street. So anything, again, to get cars off the road. So we were talking about possible multi-story parking garage, perhaps with a solar canopy. We were thinking about electric vehicles and charging for those electric vehicles. We were talking about having buses on the site that could also transport people throughout Concord to the trains, things like that. So transportation was definitely a big one. One of the things that came up in our group was thinking to the future, thinking about some town buildings that are in the floodplain currently and how this cleanup will take place over the course of the next few years, thinking about what the needs in the future might be. So perhaps relocating some town buildings or anything to optimize or better utilize space for town functions, public works, municipal buildings, storage, warehouses, things like that were brought up. We're also talking about Concord's aging population and how the housing needs might change, talking about affordable housing and particularly talking about senior centers and assisted living. So that sort of residential use was brought up. Also indoor recreation and a little bit of outdoor recreation. We were talking about bike paths. We were talking about ways that natural area might be utilized. And we were talking about kind of smart growth, coupling things like innovator spaces, office buildings, artist spaces, combining that with other uses so that we have a combination of things that will help the town and things that will bring in income. So that was my group.
Okay. We are the fourth and final group. And can you flip it the other way? Flip that down. Thank you. Perfect. This group had a lot of similar themes. I would say that while these are not necessarily priorities, they're examples of a mix of uses that the group felt was a strong recommendation, that there would likely be a mix of uses and that it could include condo-style housing, something along the lines of a regional transit hub, a facility for grid storage. Seasonal workforce housing was one of the items that was brought up that could be integrated into some condo-style housing without necessarily being a standalone affordable housing development. And then I think that probably one of the bigger ideas that seemed to gain traction was the idea that having utilities and infrastructure to support sustainability in the future would be an important investment to make. That having conduit in place for the, to provide electrical service, to have fiber optic service, to have the ability to tie into the grid if grid storage was going to be something that could go there. So those are the kinds of things that the group seemed to coalesce around. I think that wraps up the report out. A few quick next steps in terms of notes. Chris, do you have a few final words from EPA's perspective?
Sure. So like I said, that consent decree, the public comment period just began. It's a 30-day public comment period. On the handout that Sarah printed out, there's a link to where you can find the consent decree. So you're welcome to read it. Again, have to limit my contact as an EPA representative about the consent decree during that public comment period, but we'll definitely be looking forward to meeting with you guys in the future, whoever's interested in terms of being involved with the more technical end of the cleanup, whereas this is more focused on redevelopment. And I'll let Matt talk more about next steps as it pertains to redevelopment stuff.
So as far as what we'll be doing from in supporting EPA and the community moving forward, we'll take the input that came out of tonight's meeting and we'll work with the town and the reuse committee to develop this into a set of workshop recommendations. We'll integrate that into a larger reuse assessment report that we'll provide to EPA and the town that can be carried forward in both of their processes. And we expect to be done with that by the end of the calendar year. That's all I have. Are you going to close?
Sure. And just on behalf of the committee, we will take that report and probably do a little bit more due diligence on behalf of the select board, trying to report back to the select board by the end of next year. Based on these workshop recommendations, we'll obviously be coming back to the public for some more public input and feedback on those combination of uses that come together out of the workshop report, and think a little bit about, for the select board, how these combinations might meet the principles that we laid out at the start of the workshop and that are on the 4th page of your handout if you have it. So that would be our goal. But I just want to end by thanking everybody for coming out. We're going to do this whole thing again now from 7 to 9, but we really appreciate everybody who came and gave us such a great turnout for the 5 o'clock session. So this is a great start to the process. Thank you. Thanks to everybody else.
Thank you.